The doors of Caldwell Manor burst open so hard the hinges screamed. Lady Portia Thistlewood stumbled in, her cheeks burning, her hands trembling at her sides. Behind her, the whispers followed like smoke, curling through the grand hall, wrapping around every chandelier, every gilded mirror, every polished face that turned to stare. They sent her, someone hissed from behind a fan. Of all the girls in the county, they sent her. Laughter. Low, cruel, barely hidden. The Thistlewood family had done the unthinkable. Every noble family in the region had been invited to present a daughter before His Grace, Duke Rainford Calloway, the most powerful and coldest man in all of England. And the Thistlewoods, desperate, drowning in debt, and completely out of options, had pushed forward their eldest daughter, Portia. Not the pretty one, or not the slim one, not the one the town poets wrote verses about. Portia, the one the village gossips called too much, too tall, too round, too loud when she laughed, too bold when she spoke, too everything that a proper lady was never supposed to be. Her own cousins had giggled the entire carriage ride over. Her aunt had sighed 12 times before they reached the gate, and her younger sister had whispered, "This is embarrassing," just loud enough for Portia to hear. But Portia had lifted her chin, smoothed her gloves, and walked through those doors anyway. Now she stood in the middle of the hall, surrounded by the most beautiful women in England, every single one of them staring at her like she was a mistake someone forgot to correct. And then the Duke walked in. The room fell completely silent, or Duke Rainford moved through the crowd without looking left or right, his jaw sharp, his eyes unreadable, his presence so heavy the very air seemed to tighten. He stopped. He looked across the room, and somehow, out of every glittering, perfectly dressed woman standing there, his gaze landed on Portia. It didn't move, not for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "That one," he said. "I want to speak with that one." The hall erupted. "Now tell me, what do you think the Duke saw in Portia that no one else could see? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. If this story already has your heart, please hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will completely change everything you think you know about this Duke. On the morning Portia Thistlewood was chosen to represent her family before the Duke, she was in the kitchen garden pulling up carrots with her bare hands. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. Because the soil was honest. It did not look at her the way people did. It did not measure her waist, or count the inches of her arms, or whisper behind gloved fingers when she walked past. The garden simply grew, and Portia simply tended it, and for a few quiet hours each morning, the world left her alone. That peace ended the moment her Aunt Lavinia came storming through the iron gate with a letter crushed in her fist and a look on her face that meant something terrible was about to happen. "Get up," Aunt Lavinia said, not bothering with good morning. "Clean yourself. We have been summoned." Portia stood slowly, brushing dirt from her palms. "Oh, summoned by whom?" Aunt Lavinia thrust the letter forward. The wax seal was unmistakable. Every family in the county knew it. A raven with its wings spread wide, stamped in black. The seal of House Calloway. The Duke of Rainford was selecting a wife. Portia read the letter twice. Then she looked up at her aunt. "You are not seriously considering sending me?" Aunt Lavinia did not answer. She turned and walked back toward the house. That silence was its own kind of answer, and Portia felt it land in her chest like a stone dropping into still water. Inside the manor, chaos had already taken hold. Her younger sister Felicity was spinning in front of the tall mirror in the drawing room, holding up her hair with both hands and practicing her smile. Her cousin Dorothea was rifling through the wardrobe chest, pulling out fabrics and tossing aside anything she considered unworthy of a duke's attention. Her other cousin Harriet sat on the windowsill, eating a biscuit and watching everything with the lazy amusement of someone who had no stakes in the outcome. Nobody was preparing anything for Portia. Nobody had even considered that Portia might need to prepare. It was Felicity who finally said it, not cruelly, but carelessly, which was almost worse. "Aunt Lavinia cannot send you, Portia. It would embarrass the whole family. Surely she means to send me." Portia said nothing. She walked to the window and looked out at the long gravel drive that led away from Thistlewood Manor and wound through the low hills toward the rest of the world. But Aunt Lavinia appeared in the doorway before Felicity could say another word. Or she looked at each girl in turn, and then she looked at Portia with that flat, calculating expression she wore whenever she was doing arithmetic in her head. "Felicity is already promised to young Mr. Henwick," she said. "Informally, yes. But a promise is a promise. I will not risk it." Felicity gasped. Dorothea stopped rifling. Even Harriet paused mid-biscuit. Aunt Lavinia pressed on. "Dorothea has that business with the Pemworth family that we cannot afford to disturb. Harriet is 17, and far too young to be paraded before a man like Rainford Calloway." She folded her hands in front of her, with the careful composure of a woman who had already made up her mind and simply wanted the room to stop arguing with it. Portia goes. The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. Dorothea recovered first. She pressed her lips together and looked at Portia with something between pity and relief. Harriet turned back to her biscuit, and Felicity, sweet, thoughtless Felicity, said quietly, "But he will laugh at her." Portia turned from the window. She did not cry. She wanted to. She felt the pressure of it sitting just behind her eyes, hot and sharp. But she had learned a very long time ago that crying in front of this family only gave them more to whisper about later. So she straightened her back, lifted her chin and said, "Then I suppose he will laugh. Tell me what time the carriage departs." Aunt Lavinia blinked. She had expected more resistance. The flicker of surprise on her face was small, but Portia caught it, and she held on to it quietly, like a candle in a dark room. They left Thistlewood Manor at 9:30 the following morning. The carriage was old, and the springs were soft on one side, so the whole thing leaned slightly to the left throughout the journey. Aunt Lavinia sat rigid and silent across from Portia. Dorothea had insisted on coming along as a chaperone, which really meant she wanted to watch, and she spent the entire ride studying Portia with barely concealed fascination, as though she were trying to understand how a person could walk willingly into humiliation. Harriet had waved from the front steps as the carriage pulled away. That wave was the kindest thing anyone had done for Portia all morning. The road to Calloway House wound through old elm trees so tall their branches met overhead and turned the morning light green and gold. It was beautiful, Portia thought, or the kind of beauty that did not care whether you deserved to look at it, the kind that simply existed and let you either appreciate it or miss it entirely. She chose to appreciate it. Calloway House came into view near noon. It was massive and grey and serious, with 4 towers that rose against the sky like arguments no one had ever won. The grounds were immaculate. The hedges were cut at perfect angles. Every flower appeared to be blooming on instruction. Even the birds seemed quieter here, as though they too understood that this was a place where one was expected to behave. The carriage stopped at the front entrance, and a footman opened the door with practiced efficiency. Portia stepped out first, because Aunt Lavinia was still gathering her gloves, and as Portia's feet touched the gravel, She looked up at the house and felt something shift inside her. Not fear, exactly. Something sharper than fear. Something that felt almost like readiness. The grand hall was already full when they arrived. Families from across 3 counties had answered the Duke's summons, and every one of them had brought their most eligible daughter. The room gleamed with carefully arranged beauty. Silk and pearl and powder and posture, each young woman presented like a painting someone hoped would sell. Portia stood among them in her good wool dress, her brown hair pinned up in simple curls, her cheeks flushed from the journey, and she was immediately, visibly, undeniably different. She heard the first whisper within 30 seconds of entering. "Is that truly a Thistlewood? The family has fallen further than I thought." She kept walking. "Goodness! She is large. Do you think she knows how large she is?" She kept her chin level. "Someone should tell the aunt. This is unkind to the poor girl." That one almost reached her. Almost. But Portia breathed through her nose and found a spot near the tall window at the far end of the room where the light came in warm and steady, and she stood there and watched the door. And then Duke Rainford Calloway walked in. He was not what she had expected. She had expected arrogance, worn openly, the way so many powerful men wore it, like a coat they were proud of. But Rainford Calloway carried his authority differently. It was quiet. It was settled. He moved through the room without performance, without the small acknowledgments and charming nods that men who needed to be liked always gave. He simply entered, and the room rearranged itself around him, the way water moves around stone. He was tall, dark-haired, with eyes the color of deep winter water, and a jaw that looked like it had never once yielded to anything. There was a scar, faint but visible, along his left temple, and there was something behind his eyes that Portia could not immediately name. Something that looked almost like exhaustion. Not the tiredness of a man who had not slept, the tiredness of a man who had been surrounded by performance for so long that real things had become difficult to recognize. His gaze swept the room. It passed over the beauties assembled for his consideration, one by one, briefly, distantly, the way a man looks at things he has already decided are not what he is looking for. And then it reached Portia. And it stopped. She did not look away, or she knew she should. Every rule of propriety said she should lower her gaze, tilt her head, defer. But something in the way he was looking at her made her feel that looking away would be the wrong answer to a question she had only just been asked. So she held his gaze. For 3 full seconds, maybe 4, the Duke of Rainford looked at Portia Thistlewood, and Portia Thistlewood looked back at him. Then he crossed the room. Not toward the Harrington girl with the golden hair who had practiced her curtsy for 2 weeks. Not toward Lady Featherstone's eldest, who had been told since birth that she was born for exactly this kind of room. He crossed the room toward the window where Portia stood, and every single head in that hall turned to follow him. He stopped in front of her. He was closer than propriety strictly allowed, though not so close as to cause a scene. And he said, with a voice that was low and precise, and carried no performance in it whatsoever, "You are not afraid." It was not a question. Portia looked at him steadily. "I have been afraid of smaller things than this," she said. "I decided some time ago that fear was not a good enough reason to look away from something." Something moved in his face. It was very small and very quick, and if she had blinked, she would have missed it entirely. But she didn't blink. "Tell me your name," he said. "Portia Thistlewood," she said. "My family sent me as a formality. They did not expect anything to come of it." She did not know why she told him that. It was not the kind of thing one said in a room full of people competing for a duke's favour. But it was the truth, and something about this man made dishonesty feel like a worse risk than honesty. He studied her for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Then your family underestimates you." He turned and walked away before she could answer. Behind her, she heard Aunt Lavinia make a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a prayer. And somewhere across the room, someone dropped a glass. The rest of the afternoon passed in a long blur of formal introductions, stiff conversation, and tiny sandwiches that no one actually ate. Portia stood where she was told to stand, said what she was supposed to say, and tried not to think too hard about what had just happened. But she could not stop thinking about it, because the Duke had not spoken to another woman after speaking to her. Not once. He had moved through the obligatory pleasantries that the gathering required, shaken the necessary hands, exchanged the necessary words with the necessary fathers, but his attention had not landed on anyone else the way it had landed on her. By the time the carriages were called and families began filtering out into the cooling afternoon, the whispers in the room had changed character entirely. They were still talking about Portia, but the tone was different now. It was no longer simply unkind, it was bewildering. It was irritating. It was the particular sound a room makes when something has happened that does not fit the story everyone agreed to tell. In the carriage on the way home, Aunt Lavinia said nothing for so long that Portia actually began to wonder if the woman had learned to breathe through her skin. Then, at last, Aunt Lavinia said, "He spoke to you." "Yes," Portia said. "He spoke to you first, and then to no one else." "That is what happened." Another silence. Then, "What did you say to him?" "The truth," Portia said simply. Aunt Lavinia turned to look at her as though she were a piece of furniture that had suddenly stood up and introduced itself. And for the first time in as long as Portia could remember, her aunt had absolutely nothing to say. 3 days passed before the letter arrived. During those 3 days, Thistlewood Manor became a very strange place to live. Aunt Lavinia walked from room to room with the distracted energy of a woman trying to recalculate something enormous. Felicity asked Portia what she had said to the Duke at least 9 separate times, and received the same answer each time, which frustrated her deeply. Aunt Dorothea wrote 3 letters to friends in other counties, and then burned all 3 of them, apparently deciding she did not yet know enough to be interested. Harriet, who understood nothing about the situation, and cared even less, continued eating biscuits and watching everything with cheerful detachment. Portia spent those 3 days in the garden. She was not waiting. She told herself firmly that she was not waiting. She was simply tending to things that needed tending, pulling weeds, staking the climbing roses, checking the soil around the herb beds. Normal things. Grounded things. But each time she heard the sound of hooves on the gravel drive, she went still. The letter came on a Tuesday morning, carried by a rider in Callaway livery, who handed it directly to Aunt Lavinia with the gravity of a man delivering something important. The seal was the same as before, the raven with its wings spread wide, stamped in black. Aunt Lavinia read it twice, standing in the front hall, and then she sat down on the bench by the door, which she had never done before in all the years Portia had known her, because Aunt Lavinia considered sitting in hallways undignified. Portia came in from the garden and found her there. "What does it say?" Portia asked. Aunt Lavinia looked up. Her expression was one Portia had never seen on that particular face before. It was stripped of its usual calculation, its habitual cool management of every situation. What remained underneath was something raw and slightly stunned. "He wants you to come back," Aunt Lavinia said. Portia held very still. For another group gathering? No. Aunt Lavinia held out the letter. Stood alone. The letter was short and direct, written in a hand that was firm and slanted slightly to the right, the writing of a man who moved through decisions quickly. Duke Rainford Calloway requested the pleasure of Miss Portia Thistlewood's company at Calloway House for a private afternoon visit at her earliest convenience, pending the approval and accompaniment of her family. The language was formal and correct in every way, but the fact of the letter itself, the fact that it had come at all, that it had come addressed specifically to her and not to the family generally, that it had arrived not 2 weeks after the gathering but 3 days, that was not formal at all. That was something else, entirely. The household erupted. Felicity cried, not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming pressure of feelings she could not organize quickly enough. Dorothea declared loudly that there had clearly been a mistake, and that someone ought to write back and clarify. Harriet said, "Good for Portia," and went back to her book. Aunt Lavinia sent for the seamstress within the hour. Portia sat with the letter in her hands long after everyone else had moved on to their respective reactions and preparations. She read it several more times, not because the words were complicated, because she was trying to understand what was underneath them. She thought about the way he had looked at her across that crowded room, the way his gaze had stopped, the way he had walked toward her, past women who were, by every conventional measurement, more suited to his world than she was. The way he had said, "For you are not afraid," as though he had been looking for exactly that. She thought about his eyes, that deep winter watercolor, and the exhaustion she had seen in them that had nothing to do with sleep. She wrote back the same afternoon. She accepted. The visit was set for the following Thursday. In the days between, Portia noticed something she had not expected. The town noticed. Word had travelled, as word always did in communities where everyone's business was everyone else's entertainment, and by Wednesday, when Portia and Harriet walked to the market for thread and flour, people were looking at her differently. Not kindly, necessarily. Some looks were simply curiosity. That wide-eyed examination of a situation people found surprising and could not yet explain. But some looks were something else, something harder. Mrs. Colville, who ran the fabric shop and had 3 unmarried daughters of her own, watched Portia walk past the window with an expression that could have started a fire. The Harrington girl, who had been at the gathering, and whose golden hair had not been enough to hold the Duke's attention, crossed to the other side of the lane without acknowledging Portia at all. And then there was Lord Bertram Fitch. Lord Fitch was the kind of man who existed in every county, the sort who had just enough wealth and position to feel entitled to opinions about other people's lives, but not quite enough to be truly powerful, which made him meaner than a truly powerful man would bother to be. He was standing outside the solicitor's office when Portia and Harriet passed, and he looked at Portia with a thin smile that had no warmth in it whatsoever. "Oh, Miss Thistlewood," he said pleasantly. "I hear Calloway has taken a peculiar interest in you. I do hope you are not reading too much into it. Men like him sometimes collect curiosities. It doesn't mean they intend to keep them." Harriet sucked in a sharp breath beside Portia. Portia stopped walking. She turned to look at Lord Fitch with the particular stillness she had perfected over years of receiving exactly this kind of remark from exactly this kind of person. "How kind of you to share your theory, Lord Fitch," she said. "I shall give it all the weight it deserves." She turned and walked on. Harriet caught up with her 3 steps later and grabbed her arm. "That was magnificent," Harriet whispered. "That was necessary," Portia said. But her heart was beating harder than she would have liked. Thursday arrived in the way that days do when you have been both dreading and anticipating them. Too quickly and then suddenly all at once. Calloway House in the afternoon light was different from Calloway House in the morning. Warmer, somehow. The grey stone took on something almost golden, and the shadows moved gently across the grounds in a way that made the whole place feel slightly less like a fortress, and slightly more like something that was still deciding what it wanted to be. They were received by the Duke's butler, a man named Pratchett, who had the erect posture of a man who had ironed his spine. He led Portia and Aunt Lavinia through a series of corridors lined with portraits of Calloway ancestors, serious faces in heavy frames, the accumulated weight of generations looking down from every wall. For the Duke was in the east sitting room. He stood when they entered, which Portia had not quite expected, and the simple courtesy of it caught her somewhere soft. The room held a fire, even though the afternoon was not cold, and 2 other people were present. One was a woman of perhaps 50, with sharp eyes and a direct bearing, who was introduced as Lady Constance Morrow, the Duke's aunt, and the nearest thing he had to a living family member in residence. The other was a young man of around 25, with an open, pleasant face and ink stains on his right hand, introduced as Mr. Callum Dray, the Duke's personal secretary, and, it became clear very quickly, something considerably closer to a friend than that title suggested. Aunt Lavinia was smoothly and efficiently engaged by Lady Constance within minutes of sitting down, drawn into a conversation about the county's botanical society that left her both flattered and too occupied to monitor Portia's every word, which left Portia and the Duke. He sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. Outside the window, a bird called once and went silent. Portia became aware that this was the first time she had been in a room with this man without 50 other people watching both of them, and the difference was enormous. He was more present here, more real. The public version of him, the controlled, authority-carrying, room-silencing Duke, was still visible in his posture and his bearing. But here there were small things she hadn't been able to see before. The way his right hand rested on the arm of the chair with a slight tension in the fingers, as though he was holding something back, the faint line between his brows that suggested he thought carefully and often, the way he watched her, not with the assessing look of a man evaluating a candidate, but with something that felt more like genuine attention. "I was not certain you would come," he said. "I considered not coming," she said honestly. "I thought it might be simpler. And yet you came." "Simpler is not always better," she said. Something in him settled slightly, as though an answer he had been holding a question open for had finally arrived. "I owe you an apology," he said then, and the words were unexpected enough that Portia blinked. "For what?" she asked. "For the gathering," he said, "for the way it was structured, as a selection." His jaw tightened slightly. "I did not design it. It was my solicitor's arrangement, made on my behalf while I was away, and I only learned of the precise nature of it when I arrived. I found it distasteful." "But you did not cancel it," Portia said. "No," he agreed. "I did not." He met her gaze. "I should have." The honesty in that admission was so clean and direct that Portia felt it move through the careful layers she had built around herself over years of being underestimated. "Why did you want to speak with me specifically?" she asked. "There were women in that room who are better suited to your world than I am." "I know," he said. "I spoke with you because you were the only person in that room who was not trying to be something for my benefit." Portia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is either a very perceptive observation or a very strange basis for an invitation." The corner of his mouth moved. It was so small she almost missed it, but it was unmistakably the beginning of something that might, under different circumstances, have become a smile? Possibly both, he said. The afternoon moved forward in conversation that was nothing like what Portia had expected from a formal visit. They talked about books, and she discovered he had strong opinions about history and weak patience for novels that prioritized sentiment over intelligence, a position she disagreed with completely and told him so directly. They talked about the estate, and she noticed how he spoke about the land itself with a care that had nothing performative in it. They talked about nothing important and everything important, the way two people sometimes do when they are actually listening to each other. At one point, Mr. Dray, who had been sitting quietly near the bookshelves doing something with a stack of papers, laughed at something Portia said about agricultural reform, and the Duke turned to look at him with an expression that suggested this was not a sound he heard frequently. Lady Constance, who had apparently been paying more attention to Portia than to Aunt Lavinia's remarks about the Botanical Society, leaned forward at one point and said, with the bluntness of a woman who had given up on indirection sometime in her 40s, "You have a spine, Miss Thistlewood. I like that. This house needs someone with a spine." Aunt Lavinia made a small, strangled sound. Portia said, "Thank you, Lady Constance. I have had considerable practice using it." Lady Constance laughed. It was a genuine sound that rang off the ceiling and seemed to take the whole room by surprise, including, Portia noticed, the Duke himself, who looked at his aunt for a brief moment with something that looked almost like warmth. When the visit concluded and the carriage was brought around, the Duke walked Portia and Aunt Lavinia to the entrance himself, which Pratchett's expression suggested was not his usual practice. At the door, while Aunt Lavinia descended the front steps toward the carriage, the Duke paused beside Portia and said quietly, too low for anyone else to hear, "I would like to write to you, if you are willing." Portia looked at him. The late afternoon light was behind him, and his face was half in shadow, and she thought again about that exhaustion she had seen in him at the gathering, at the kind that comes from a long time of not being met honestly by anyone. "I am willing," she said. She descended the steps. She did not look back, but she heard him still standing there, and she knew without turning that he was watching the carriage until it rounded the elm-lined bend and disappeared from sight. In the carriage, Aunt Lavinia sat in absolute silence for 10 minutes. Then she said, in a voice that sounded like a woman revising a very long document, "I may have miscalculated." Portia looked out the window at the elms moving past, their branches catching the last of the light, and she allowed herself, quietly, privately, to feel the full weight of what the afternoon had been. It was considerable, and somewhere beneath the caution and the careful thinking and the years of practice at not wanting things too loudly, and something in her that had been very still for a very long time had begun, tentatively, like the first green thing after frost, to stir. The first letter arrived on a Saturday. Portia was in the kitchen garden again when Harriet came running across the grass with it held above her head like a flag, her face split with a grin she was making no effort to contain. "It has the raven seal," Harriet announced breathlessly, dropping it into Portia's soil-dusted hands. "I checked. Twice." Portia turned it over. The black wax seal stared up at her, wings spread, serious and certain. She slid her thumb beneath it carefully, the way you open something you are not sure you are ready for. The letter was 2 pages long. The handwriting was the same firm, slightly rightward slant she had seen before. He wrote the way he spoke, directly, while without decoration, but with a precision that made every sentence feel considered. He began by asking about her garden, not politely, not as a pleasantry dropped at the opening of a letter to fill space before the real content. He asked specifically, because he had noticed during her visit that soil had been embedded under 2 of her fingernails when she arrived, and he had found himself curious about what she had been tending to that morning. Portia read that line 3 times. He had noticed her hands, not to judge them, not to note the absence of perfect, idle softness that fashionable ladies were supposed to maintain. He had noticed them the way someone notices a detail that tells them something true about a person, and he had filed it away and thought about it afterward, and then written about it. She sat down on the low stone wall beside the herb bed, and read the rest standing up in her mind, even though she was physically sitting. He wrote about the estate, about a problem with the eastern drainage field that his land steward, a gruff and capable man named Oswick, had identified and was working to resolve. He wrote about a disagreement he had with his solicitor, a Mr. Pendleton, over the terms of a neighbouring land lease, and he described Pendleton's argument and his own counter-argument with the directness of a man thinking on paper. And then, at the bottom of the second page, in handwriting that pressed slightly harder into the paper than the rest, as though the words had required more weight to put down, he wrote, "I am not skilled at this. Writing to someone I actually wish to hear from, I find it is different from all other correspondence." Portia folded the letter. She held it against her chest for a moment, feeling the paper there, solid and real. Then she went inside and wrote back immediately. She wrote about the garden. She told him about the climbing roses that refused to behave, and the herb bed she had replanted twice because something kept eating the basil at night, and she suspected Harriet's cat, but had no proof. She wrote about a book she had been reading, a history of the Ottoman court that she had found in her uncle's old library, and she told him her thoughts on it plainly, and without softening them into the careful non-committal observations women were expected to offer when discussing anything serious. And at the bottom of her own letter, pressing her pen into the paper the same way he had, as she wrote, "I find it is different for me as well." She sealed it before she could reconsider. The letters began arriving every 4 days after that. His were always 2 pages, always direct, always containing at least one thing that surprised her. He told her once that he had not laughed genuinely in company for almost 2 years before the afternoon she had argued with him about novels. He told her once that Calloway House had felt like a place he administered rather than a place he lived in, and that he was not entirely sure when that had changed, or whether it had changed fully yet. He told her once, in the middle of a paragraph about a parliamentary matter that had been consuming his attention, that he had found himself thinking about what she would say about it, and had felt the absence of her opinion like a gap in a conversation. Portia read that letter 4 times. Then she put it in the wooden box she had cleared out from under her bed and lined with an old piece of soft cloth. She was building a box of his words without quite deciding to. Meanwhile, the world outside Thistlewood Manor was watching. Lord Fitch had apparently not lost interest in the situation. He had begun making remarks in public spaces with the practiced casualness of a man who wanted his cruelty to appear as concern. At a county assembly that Portia attended with Felicity and Dorothea 3 weeks after the private visit, he positioned himself near enough to a group of chattering ladies that his words would carry to Portia across the room. "The Duke is an eccentric man," Fitch said to no one in particular, and everyone within earshot. "He has always enjoyed the unconventional, a temporary fascination. Nothing more." The ladies he was speaking near laughed delicately. Portia kept her face still. Felicity, beside her, reached down and squeezed her hand hard. Portia squeezed back, but later that evening, in the quiet of her room, she took out the latest letter and read it again. And she thought about Fitch's words with the part of her brain that refused to simply feel things and always insisted on examining them too. Temporary fascination. Nothing more. Was it possible? Was she building something in her head that existed differently in his? She was practical enough to ask the question. She was honest enough to sit with the discomfort of not knowing the answer. The next morning, she received a letter she had not expected. It was not from Rainford. It was from Lady Constance Morrow, written in a bold and angular hand that suited her entirely. "Miss Thistlewood," it began, with no preamble. "My nephew has smiled twice in the past 3 weeks. I have lived in this house for 11 years, and I am telling you that is extraordinary. Whatever you are doing, do not stop. Come to dinner on Friday, that is not a question. C. Morrow." Portia read it and felt something bloom warm and complicated in her chest. She wrote back, accepting it within the hour. The Friday dinner was smaller than the formal visit had been. Lady Constance, Rainford, Mr. Dray, and a fourth guest, a quiet and intelligent woman named Mrs. Petra O'Sey, who was Lady Constance's closest friend and who watched everything from behind kind eyes, with the observational precision of someone who had spent decades understanding people without announcing that she was doing so. Aunt Lavinia had been invited, but sent her apologies due to a head cold. Portia arrived with only Harriet as company, which felt immediately more honest. The dinner conversation moved fast and freely, a quality that Portia recognized as the direct result of Lady Constance, who seemed to run her table the way a conductor runs an orchestra, drawing out each person's contribution at the right moment and cutting off tedium before it could settle. At one point, the conversation turned to inheritance law and its effects on women's property rights, and Portia, who had thought carefully about this subject for personal and immediate reasons, spoke at length and with considerable feeling. When she finished, the table was briefly quiet. Then Mr. Dray said, "That is the clearest argument I have heard on that subject from anyone." "Mrs." O'Sey nodded slowly. "Agreed. You should be writing this down, Miss Thistlewood." Portia looked at Rainford. He was watching her with an expression she could not fully read, but it was not the expression of a man who was embarrassed by what she had said, or wishing she had said less. It was the expression of a man who was paying very close attention and finding everything he was paying attention to worthwhile. After dinner, while Lady Constance drew Mr. Dray and Mrs. O'Sey into a debate about a painting she had acquired, Rainford and Portia stood near the tall windows that looked out over the night garden. "You argue like someone who has been told her arguments do not count," he said. Portia looked at him. "That is because I have been." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "They count here." 3 words. A simple and direct, and delivered without drama or flourish. And yet they reached somewhere in Portia that had been waiting a long time to hear something like them, and the whole careful architecture of distance she maintained cracked slightly, right down the middle, without making a sound. She looked back out at the dark garden. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It is not a kindness," he said. "It is a fact." Outside, the wind moved through the garden, and the candlelight in the room shifted, and Portia stood in the warm, unsteady light, and felt, with a certainty she was not yet ready to name, that something between them had moved past the point of being a temporary fascination. Whatever it was not that. But before she could settle into the feeling, before she could even turn it over and examine it properly, something else happened, or something that changed everything. Pratchett appeared in the doorway of the dining room with the careful urgency of a man delivering bad news in a controlled manner. He spoke quietly to Rainford, too low for Portia to hear. But she saw Rainford's shoulders change. She saw the careful public stillness drop over him like a curtain being drawn, and something cold and deliberate replaced the openness of 10 seconds ago. He turned to the room. "Forgive me," he said. I must attend to something." He left. His exit was smooth and gave nothing away to anyone in the room who was not watching closely. Portia was watching closely. She caught Mr. Dray's eye across the room. He gave her the smallest, most controlled look of warning she had ever received. Something was wrong, and something had arrived tonight that was not in the letters and had not been part of any conversation, and whatever it was had put the shutters back up on Rainford Calloway's face so fast she had barely seen them move. She rode home that night through the dark elm-lined road with Harriet sleeping against her shoulder and a feeling sitting in her stomach that was quiet and heavy and would not be reasoned away. The name arrived in Portia's world on a Monday morning, carried inside a piece of gossip that Dorothea delivered over breakfast, with the particular energy of someone who had been waiting all night to say it. "Lady Vivian Stanhope is in the county," Dorothea announced, setting down her teacup with a small, precise click. "She arrived at Ashmore Park yesterday evening. The whole town knows." Felicity looked up from her toast. But Aunt Lavinia went still in the way she went still when information required immediate processing. Portia said, "I do not know that name." Dorothea looked at her with the expression of someone who cannot quite believe they are having to explain this. "Vivian Stanhope," she repeated. "Her father is the Earl of Stanhope. She is considered one of the finest matches in the country. She is beautiful in the way that painters argue about, and she has been abroad for 2 years. Dorothea paused for effect. She and Duke Rainford were nearly engaged 4 years ago. The kitchen went very quiet. Portia picked up her cup and drank her tea. "Nearly," she said. "The families had an understanding," Dorothea said. "Something happened. Nobody knows exactly what. She went to the continent. He stopped receiving visitors for 6 months. And now she has come back." Portia put her cup down with a steadiness that cost her something. "Thank you for telling me," she said. And she meant it. Because knowing was always better than not knowing, even when what you knew felt like stepping onto ground that had just shifted beneath you. She went to the garden. She pulled weeds she did not need to pull, and staked plants that did not need staking, and told herself with great firmness that she was not owed anything, that letters and dinners and quiet conversations by windows were not promises, that she was a practical woman who understood how the world worked and how men like Rainford Calloway moved through it, and what women like Vivian Stanhope, Earl's daughters, continent polished, with the history of almost engagements behind them, represented in that world. Or she told herself all of that very thoroughly. It did not help at all. The letter she had been expecting from Rainford did not come on Thursday as usual. It did not come on Friday. On Saturday morning she received instead a brief note, 4 lines, very correct, very formal, informing her that a pressing matter required his attention this week and asking her to forgive the interruption in their correspondence. No explanation of what the pressing matter was. No warmth in the closing line. 4 lines. Portia read it once, put it in the wooden box with the others, and closed the lid. Then she did something she had not done in a very long time. She walked to the small sitting room at the back of the house, the one nobody used because the window had a crack in it, and the furniture was old. And she sat in the worn armchair in the corner, and she let herself feel the full weight of what the past week had dropped on her. It was considerable. She had not realized, until the ground shifted, how much she had been standing on it. She was still sitting there an hour later when Harriet found her. Harriet did not say anything clever or comforting or analytical. She simply pulled the footstool over and sat beside Portia and handed her a biscuit and was quiet. That was enough. 2 days later, Lord Fitch appeared at Thistlewood Manor. He came ostensibly to speak with Aunt Lavinia about a parish matter, But Aunt Lavinia was out, and he was shown to the sitting room where Portia and Felicity were present. Felicity excused herself almost immediately, sensing something in the air that she did not want to be part of. And Fitch sat down with the ease of a man who had been waiting for an opportunity and was pleased that it had arrived. "Miss Thistlewood," he said pleasantly, "I hope you are well." "Well enough," Portia said. "I imagine things have been somewhat unsettled this week," he said, with the tone of someone pretending to offer sympathy while actually pointing at a wound. "Lady Vivian's return has caused quite a stir. The county is very interested." "The county often is," Portia said. Fitch leaned forward slightly. "She is remarkable, Vivian Stanhope. I have known her since she was 17. There is history there with Calloway. The kind of history that does not simply dissolve." He smiled. "What I would not wish you to have invested too deeply in something that may resolve itself quite naturally in another direction." Portia looked at him with the stillness she had been practicing since childhood. "Lord Fitch," she said, "I notice you have a great deal of interest in the direction of my life. I find that curious, given that we are not close acquaintances and my affairs do not affect yours in any measurable way." Fitch's smile stiffened slightly. "I am simply being considerate," he said. "You are not," Portia said simply, "but I appreciate the visit." She stood. He had no choice but to stand also. He left. Portia sat back down and exhaled slowly through her nose. The following morning brought something unexpected. A carriage pulled up the drive of Thistlewood Manor, and from it stepped not Rainford, and not a letter, but Mr. de Callum Dray, with his ink-stained hand and his open, careful face. He was shown in and sat across from Portia in the front sitting room and turned his hat in his hands once before he spoke. "I am here without the Duke's knowledge," he said immediately. "I want to be clear about that. He did not send me, and he does not know I am here." Portia studied him. "Then why are you here?" "Because I have been his secretary and his friend for 6 years," Dray said, "and I have never seen him be a fool before, and I am finding it difficult to watch." Portia was quiet. She waited. "Lady Vivian is here," Dray said. "She came to the house 3 days ago, unannounced. She has made it clear to him, and to anyone within hearing, that she regrets what happened 4 years ago, and that she is prepared to resume their connection." Portia's hands were very still in her lap. "Rainford," Dray continued, "is not in love with Vivian Stanhope. He has not been for a long time, possibly not ever, though I suspect he believed himself to be, at one point. But she is known to him. She is safe in the way that familiar things are safe, even when they are not good." Dray looked at Portia directly. "You are not safe. You are real. And that is considerably more frightening than familiar." Portia looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because Lady Constance told me to," Dray said, and had the good grace to look slightly sheepish about it. She said, and I quote, "or that if no one went and told that girl the truth, she would go herself, and she had a bad hip and did not want to make the journey. Despite everything, despite the tight, uncomfortable weight in her chest, and the 4-line letter in the wooden box, and the full long week of not knowing, something in Portia's face moved. "Tell Lady Constance," she said slowly, "that I am grateful." Dray nodded. He stood to leave. Then he stopped at the door and turned back. "He has not written to you this week," Dray said. "But he has started 3 letters." He left. Portia sat in the sitting room for a long while after the carriage had gone. Outside the window the elm trees moved in the afternoon wind, their branches restless and alive. 3 letters. Started and not sent. She thought about a man who was frightened of real things. She thought about years of being surrounded by performance and finding genuine things difficult to trust. She thought about a scar along her left temple and winter water eyes, and a voice saying, "They count here," like it was simply a fact. She thought about herself too, about what she was, what she had always been. Too much and too loud and too present and too real, and how those had always been the words people used to diminish her, and how somewhere along the course of this strange and unexpected thing, those same qualities had become the reason a man had crossed a room full of polished, carefully arranged women and stopped in front of her. She got up. She went to the writing table. She pulled out paper and ink and she wrote a letter, not responding to his 4-line note, or not addressing Vivian or Fitch or any of the noise that had gathered around them. She wrote about something true and direct and personal, a memory from her childhood she had not told anyone, something that had shaped her, something that explained a part of her that she had kept quiet for a long time. She sealed it. She handed it to the household footman with instructions to have it delivered to Calloway House by evening. Then she went back to the garden and put her hands in the soil and waited. She did not know what would happen next. She did not know if he would open the letter tonight or leave it unopened. She did not know if Vivian Stanhope's familiar safety would prove stronger than whatever difficult and real thing had been growing between them. But she had stopped being someone who looked away from things because they were frightening. She had decided that a long time ago. She stayed in the garden until the light failed completely and the stars came out one by one above the dark elm trees, and the night was quiet and full of waiting, and she stayed in it with both hands open. The reply came the next morning before sunrise. Not a letter. A carriage. Portia heard the wheels on the gravel from her bedroom and sat up in the dark, her heart immediately awake even before the rest of her. She pushed back the curtain and looked down at the drive and saw the black Calloway carriage sitting there in the grey pre-dawn light, the horses breathing slow clouds into the cold air. She dressed quickly, without waking anyone. She came downstairs and opened the front door herself, and standing on the step, not Pratchett, not Dray, not a footman with a folded note, was Rainford Calloway. He had ridden through the night. She could see it in him. His coat was dusty from the road, his jaw shadowed, his eyes carrying that particular sharpness of a person who has been awake thinking for a very long time and has finally arrived at the end of a decision. He looked at her standing in the doorway in the early dark and said, "You sent me a letter." "I did," she said. "You told me about the day your father left," he said. "You told me you were 9 years old and you stood at the gate for 3 hours waiting because nobody had told you he was not coming back." Portia held the doorframe. "Yes." "You did not tell me that so I would feel sorry for you," he said. "No," she said. "But I told you because you needed to understand that I know what it is to wait for someone who is not coming, and I decided a long time ago that I would not do it again." The morning was completely still around them. Not even the birds had started yet. Rainford stepped forward. "I have been a coward this week." "Yes," she said. "You have." He blinked. She suspected he had expected something softer. He should have known better by now. "Vivian came to the house," he said. "I know," Portia said. "I did not invite her." "I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "I started 3 letters to you. I could not finish any of them." "Mr. Dray told me," she said. "He came here without your knowledge. He was worried you were being a fool." Something moved in Rainford's face. He was right. "He usually is, I think," Portia said. Rainford came up the last step, so that they were standing level with each other in the doorway, and the grey light was coming up slowly behind him, over the elm trees, and making the world look like something being carefully recovered from darkness. "I am not going to pretend that Vivian's return did not unsettle me," he said. "It did. Not because I want what she is offering, but because she is known. She is the kind of thing I understand how to handle. And you—" He stopped. He began again. "You are the kind of thing I do not know how to handle. And that is not a complaint. It is the most honest thing I have said to anyone in years." Portia looked at him for a long moment. "You came here before sunrise," she said. "Yes. You rode through the night." "Yes. Because of a letter I sent you about being 9 years old at a gate. Because of everything," he said, and his voice dropped low and quiet and entirely unguarded. "Because of every letter and every conversation and every moment you said exactly what you meant, when every other person in my life says only what they calculate I want to hear. Because you argued with me about novels, and you stood in that room full of people judging you, and you didn't flinch. Because you told me the truth the first day we met, when the truth was not advantageous to you." He paused. "Because I have started to understand the difference between what is familiar and what is actually worth something, and I find that you fall entirely in the second category." The first bird started somewhere in the elms. A single note, then silence, then a whole small song. Portia stepped back from the doorframe and opened the door wider. "Come inside," she said, "before the household wakes up and Aunt Lavinia finds you on the step and makes it into something formal." He almost smiled. She saw it this time, fuller than before. He stepped inside. They sat in the small back sitting room, the one with the cracked window and the worn armchair, because it was the closest room, and neither of them had the patience for formality at this hour. Portia lit the lamp on the side table. The room gathered itself in warm yellow light. "What happens with Vivian?" Portia asked, because she was not going to leave that question sitting in the corner of the room pretending it was not there. "I spoke with her yesterday evening," Rainford said. "Clearly, but I told her there was nothing to resume. She was not pleased." He looked at Portia. "She asked if it was because of you. What did you say?" "I said it was because of the truth," he said, "which includes you." Portia looked at her hands in her lap. Then she looked up. "You should know," she said, "that I am not an easy person. I have been told that repeatedly, and I have reached the age where I believe it is accurate. I have strong opinions, and I will not pretend otherwise to make a room comfortable. I am not small, and I will not shrink myself. I will always say what I mean, and sometimes that will be inconvenient." "I know," he said. "I want to be certain that you know," she said. "Portia." He said her name, just her name, and the way he said it was quiet and deliberate and full of something she had no immediate word for. "I came here before sunrise because of exactly that." She held his gaze for a long time in the warm lamplight of the worn, imperfect, cracked window room. Then, from upstairs, unmistakably, came the sound of Harriet's feet hitting the floor, followed by the rapid footsteps of someone who had heard a carriage and was not going to miss whatever was happening. Portia closed her eyes briefly. Rainford said, very quietly, "Is that the biscuit one?" "Yes," Portia said. He smiled then. Fully. Completely. And it was the kind of smile that changed a face entirely, that took a face built for gravity and seriousness, and showed what lived underneath all that careful control, something genuine and warm and younger than he usually appeared, and Portia felt it reach her somewhere she had not been reached in a very long time. Harriet arrived in the doorway in her dressing gown with her hair loose and her eyes wide, and took in the scene with the rapid assessment of someone whose observational skills had been sharpened by years of watching everything from window-sills. She looked at Portia. She looked at the Duke. She looked at the lamp, and the two chairs pulled close, and the early morning light began to show through even the cracked window. "Right," Harriet said, with great satisfaction. "I will make tea." She disappeared, and Rainford laughed. It was real and full, and it filled the small room completely, and Portia heard in it everything that the formal halls and careful letters and guarded conversations had been building toward, without either of them quite naming it. She laughed, too. Outside, the morning came fully alive around Thistlewood Manor, gold and unhurried, moving through the elms and across the garden, and in through every window, and inside the worn-back sitting-room. Something that had begun with a pair of doors bursting open, and a room full of whispers, and a man crossing a crowded hall toward someone no one expected him to choose, arrived quietly and completely at the place it had always been heading. But the world, of course, was not finished with them yet. Because 3 hours later, while Rainford was still at Thistlewood Manor, and the household had woken fully, and Aunt Lavinia had descended the stairs in a state of barely contained astonishment, a second carriage arrived on the drive. And from it stepped Lady Vivian Stanhope. She was, as Dorothea had promised, remarkable in the way that painters argued about. Tall, composed, but with the specific self-possession of a woman who had spent 2 years on the continent and returned with the certainty that she had improved on what was already considerable. She was followed by her own maid and by her brother, Lord Theo Stanhope, a broad-shouldered man with a pleasant face currently arranged into an expression of polite determination. She did not look surprised to find the Calloway carriage on Thistlewood Drive. She had expected it. She had come because of it. She looked past Pratchett, who had accompanied Rainford and was standing by the carriage, and she looked past Aunt Lavinia, who had appeared at the front door with the expression of a woman who was outranked and knew it, and her gaze travelled with absolute precision to the window of the back sitting-room, where Portia was standing. Their eyes met through the glass, and Vivian Stanhope was not a cruel woman. Portia could see that immediately, and it would have been easier if she were. She was something more complicated. She was a woman who had made a mistake 4 years ago, and had spent 2 years understanding that, and had come home to correct it, only to find that the thing she had come home to correct had moved on without her, and moved on toward something she had not anticipated and could not quite categorize. Portia did not look away. Neither did Vivian. And then Rainford appeared in the doorway of the sitting-room behind Portia, and the moment shifted entirely. Rainford stepped outside. He crossed the gravel with the calm of a man who had made his decision in the dark hours of the morning and was not going to revise it in daylight. Vivian watched him come. Up close, Portia could see from the window that something in Vivian's composure was working very hard. The perfection of her bearing was the perfection of someone who had rehearsed this moment, and was now discovering that the rehearsal had not accounted for everything. Lord Theo stepped forward slightly, the instinct of a brother who is prepared to be useful, but Vivian touched his arm briefly, and he stilled. Rainford stopped in front of her. Whatever was said between them in the next several minutes was too low for Portia to hear through the glass. She watched their faces instead. Vivian spoke first, and her expression as she spoke was one of controlled earnestness. Rainford listened without interrupting, which was something Portia had come to recognize as one of his genuine qualities. He did not cut people off. He let them finish. Not then he spoke. Vivian listened, and as she listened, the careful composure shifted. Not into anger and not into tears, but into something more honest than either, the expression of a person receiving a truth they already knew and were hoping not to have confirmed. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something short and looked past him, toward the window where Portia stood. She held Portia's gaze for 3 long seconds. Then she gave the smallest nod. Not warm, not generous, not a thing that came easily, but real. The acknowledgement of one woman to another that the better outcome had occurred, even if it was not the desired one. She turned and walked back to the carriage. Lord Theo, after one appraising look at Rainford, followed without a word. The carriage rolled away down the drive and through the elms and out of sight. Rainford stood in the gravel for a moment, his back to the house. Then he turned and came back inside. He looked at Portia. She looked at him. "That is done," he said simply. "Yes," she said. Aunt Lavinia, who had witnessed the entire exchange from the doorway with an expression cycling rapidly between shock, calculation, and something approaching wonder, pressed her lips together and withdrew into the house without saying a word. It was the most tactful thing Portia had ever seen her do. That afternoon, in the small back sitting room with the cracked window and the warm lamp, and Harriet sitting on the footstool, with studied nonchalance pretending to read, Rainford asked Portia something she had not expected. He asked her opinion of Calloway House, not as a property, not as an estate. He asked it the way someone asks about a place when they are really asking something else entirely, when the question about a house is a question about whether you could imagine it as a home, and whether you could imagine that home containing you. Portia understood what he was asking. She thought about the grey stone that went golden in the afternoon light. She thought about the portraits in the long corridors and the fire in the sitting room, even on warm days, and the garden that bloomed on instruction, and Lady Constance's full genuine laugh bouncing off the ceiling, and Pratchett's ironed spine, and Mr. Dray's ink-stained hands, and all the small, true things she had noticed about that place over the course of an autumn that had changed everything she thought she knew about what her life was allowed to be. "But I think it needs someone who is willing to make it untidy," she said, "in the best possible way." He looked at her steadily. "I think so too. The East Garden," she said, "wants entirely replanning. The formal hedges are exhausting to look at. Oswick will disagree with you." "Oswick will come around," she said. "People usually do." Rainford was quiet for a moment. Then, "Portia." "Yes." "I am asking you to marry me." He said it the same way. He said everything, directly, without flourish, without the elaborate ceremony that the occasion conventionally demanded. No knee, no prepared speech, no ring produced from a coat pocket. Just her name, and then the truth. The way he had always communicated what actually mattered. Portia felt the whole weight of the year settle and then lift. From the footstool, Harriet made a sound that was not compatible with pretending to read and gave up on the pretense entirely. "Yes," Portia said. Harriet made a considerably louder sound. Rainford looked at Harriet with an expression that was becoming increasingly familiar to Portia, that particular mixture of amusement and mild bewilderment that Harriet reliably produced in people who were not accustomed to her. "She comes with you, I take it," he said to Portia. "Often," Portia said. "Calloway House has 17 rooms," he said. "Then she can have one of them," Portia said. Harriet beamed with a brightness that could have lit the whole county. The engagement was announced the following week, and the reaction was everything and nothing that anyone had predicted. There were those who expressed genuine pleasure, Lady Constance, who said simply, "Finally," and poured wine before noon. Mr. Dray, who shook Rainford's hand for a long time, and then quietly told Portia that the house was going to become something entirely better. Mrs. Petra Osi, who wrote Portia a letter that said the world occasionally corrected itself, and this was a fine example. There were those who expressed confusion, families who had sent daughters to the gathering and were still working out how the mathematics of the situation had produced this particular result. County acquaintances who had built an understanding of how these things went and found this outcome stubbornly incompatible with that understanding. And there were those who expressed something harder. Lord Fitch was reported to have said at a public dinner that the Duke had lost his senses, a remark that was repeated back to Rainford, who received it without visible disturbance and responded by ensuring that a lease renewal Fitch had been expecting from Callaway Landholdings was reviewed very carefully and renegotiated on considerably less favourable terms. He said nothing about it to Portia. Mr. Grey told her. She found she did not object. The wedding was held 6 weeks later at the Callaway Estate Chapel, small and honest, and utterly without the excessive ceremony that neither of them wanted. Felicity cried with genuine feeling. Dorothea cried because Felicity did, and she could not bear to be the only dry face. Aunt Lavinia sat very straight and very still, and at the moment the vows were completed, Portia saw something move across her aunt's face, something private and unguarded, that might have been regret for years of careless words, or might have been simple human recognition of a moment that was larger than calculation. Harriet didn't cry. She grinned from beginning to end with the uncontained satisfaction of someone who had always known how things would turn out. The morning after the wedding, Portia walked out into the east garden of Callaway House in the early light and stood in the middle of the over-formal hedges with her hands loose at her sides and looked at the whole stiff, over-instructed space. She heard the crunch of gravel behind her, and Rainford came to stand beside her, 2 cups of tea in his hands, his coat not yet properly fastened, his hair less arranged than the county had ever seen it. He handed her a cup. They stood together in the early morning and looked at the garden. "Where do you begin?" he asked. Portia turned, but looking at every corner of it, measuring it with her eyes the way she measured things she intended to change, honestly and without flinching. "Here," she said. "We begin right here." She knelt down in the dewy grass in her good dress and pushed her fingers into the soil. And Rainford, Duke of Callaway, the coldest and most powerful man in the county, who had silenced an entire hall full of whispering, calculating, perfectly arranged people simply by crossing a room toward a woman nobody expected him to choose, sat down on the low stone border beside her and watched her with the quiet, complete attention of a man who had finally stopped being afraid of something real. Above them, the sky opened up wide and pale and full of morning, and the elms at the edge of the garden moved in the first wind of the day. And somewhere inside the house, Harriet was already awake and looking for biscuits, and the portraits of serious Callaway ancestors looked out over grounds that were, for the first time in a very long time, about to be made wonderfully, imperfectly, gloriously untidy. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.